The reprimand landed like a slap that everyone could hear. Airmen cover that ink. This is the United States Air Force flight line, not a tattoo convention. Colonel Victor Hale pitched his voice high enough that the wind carried it down the ramp and across the waiting tarmac. Heads turned the way they always do when rank chooses a target. A few junior officers smirked, then looked to Hale for the cue to keep smirking. The young woman he had singled out did not rise to meet his tone. The name tape over her heart read, Ward, Airman, First Class. Talia Ward tugged her sleeve neatly over her wrist, answered, Yes, sir, and without apology or attitude, returned to the restraint inspection of a multi-ton communications pallet lashed in the yawning mouth of a C-17. No sigh, no roll of the eyes, just hands going back to buckles, links, and pins. 50 yards off the nose of the transport, the command tent flapped in the gusts. Inside, General Owen Mercer stopped reading a weather update and looked up through the plastic window at the tableau Hale had arranged. Mercer wasn't watching Hale. He was watching Ward's hands and feet, the shape her posture made against the machine. She stood centered over the arch's shoulders, relaxed, chin level, field of vision open. No fidget, no show. Even the way she set the ratchet handle back into its cradle, flat, parallel, reachable, without looking, told him what he needed to know. He'd taught captains to pick up those small tells years ago in places where a wrong guess cost a night's sleep or a man's life. In every place that mattered, quiet economy of motion had meant one thing: a professional at work. The pallet deserved a professional. It carried a next-generation battlefield communications array, a dense cube of hardened electronics, and shock-mounted cores more expensive than the aircraft and more fragile than it looked. On the ramp, young pilots drifted close out of curiosity, then drifted back when they realized they were just in the way. Old NCOs didn't drift. They stood just out of Ward's peripheral vision and watched the way she mapped tension with 2 fingers, listened for how a chain sang across the deck when pulled to proper pitch, and felt through the soles of their boots the truth of a load settling correctly. Hale saw a slim airman in a bit of exposed ink. The master sergeant saw a set of habits that don't appear by accident. Mercer saw both wade the wind and let the scene tell on itself. Hale wasn't done. This new generation thinks regulations are suggestions, he said, pitching his lecture to the aircrew like a stage aside. An airman's job is to follow orders, maintain his standards, and know their lane. Your lane, he pointed with an open hand to the pallet, is this: we haul it. We don't decorate ourselves. He let his gaze rake Ward's frame and smirked for effect. Frankly, I question why we're letting someone your size handle assets worth 9 figures. He turned his back as if the subject were closed. The wind blew his words into the cargo bay and out across the ramp, where they thinned and died. Ward touched the top strap again and rechecked the diagonal. The buckle lay exactly where it should live, not because a checklist said so, but because gravity and friction argue in certain ways, and experience learns to answer in others. She didn't hurry. She didn't slow down to prove she wouldn't be rushed. The rhythm of her work felt like a metronome set to calm, and it settled the air around her. Sometimes the surest way to end a speech is to ignore it until the air runs out. The air changed by itself. The warning came as a metallic groan so sharp that even people who had never worked a ramp felt it behind the breastbone. A primary actuator on the loading ramp chose that moment to fail. No fireworks, just a clean mechanical betrayal, and the massive pallet jerked 2 feet to starboard as if tugged by a giant. Chains snapped like twigs. One shackle shattered inside the bright line in the deck, sparks skittering. The communications array lurched, its weight no longer a number in a notebook, but a living thing sliding where physics wanted it to go. The edge of the ramp waited like an open mouth. The crowd made the human sound people make when they know they are watching money and mission, and possibly men, slide toward destruction. Back off, someone shouted, and backs obeyed. Even experience has reflexes. Even professionals step away when 10 tons go looking for gravity. Colonel Hale froze with his mouth open and his eyes wide, trapped between authority and the laws that do not salute. The flight line squeezed itself into a ring of witnesses. Ward did not tense. She didn't look for permission because she was already inside the problem. In 3 steps, she had crossed the distance from watching to acting, a manual winch handle appearing in her hand like it had been waiting for her to call its name. She dropped it into the floor socket and cranked 1, 2, 3 each turn, riding the weight of her shoulders and hips instead of her forearms. She did not try to stop 10 tons. She vectored it. The pallet slide bent subtly, the sideways catastrophe becoming a grudging controlled drift backward. "Get clear!" Someone yelled again, but Ward had already moved the handle, clattering in the socket as she slid to the cargo lock console. Fingers flew deliberate, not frantic, through the override sequence. She had no reason to know unless she had learned it, because one day she might need it. She pulsed one lock, not all easing the strain on a single corner for a fraction of a second. The load rocked weight, answering a question asked in the right dialect. The chains that remained alive tightened where they should, slackened where they must, and the pallet obeyed. 6 inches from the lip, Ward went hard into a secondary brake lever with all her weight at the precise moment the pallet's momentum surrendered. The mechanism engaged with a report like a slam vault. The load shuddered, moaned, and then fell still, breathing out through a handful of groans that said in the language of metal it would hold if they respected it. The wind seemed to stop while the ramp remembered its shape. The only thing anyone heard was the long, collective exhale of people who had just seen a miracle disguised as physics and timing. "That's not possible," Hale said to no one in particular, which was the truest thing he'd said all morning. Ward didn't hear him. She was already kneeling to check the brake dog for a clean bite and to feel the last chain for the tension. She liked 2 clicks past. Snug the note the steels sang a matching on both sides. When she stood, she dusted her palms out of simple habit, not ceremony. The crowd remained a circle around her, not sure whether to applaud or stay very, very quiet. General Mercer crossed the distance from tent to ramp with the walk old commanders use when they don't need to run to make speed. He didn't look at the pallet more than once. His eyes stayed on Ward's face, then on the wrist where the sleeve had slipped. "Airman," he said the words steady and free of heat, "show me your wrist." Ward's gaze met his, measured and clear. She pushed the fabric back without comment. The tattoo was small, fine, and at a glance unremarkable, the silhouette of a coiled viper, black ink tight and clean, its eye a single dot of negative space. Mercer's eyes softened in the way people's eyes do when they see a memory arrive uninvited. He had seen that crest in a desert briefing room a lifetime ago, on wrists that didn't need rank to speak for them. He angled his head toward a staff sergeant with a rugged tablet. "Verification pull," he said quietly. "Airman First Class Talia Ward." "Now." The sergeant hustled the tablet into Mercer's hand. Hale arrived with all the awkwardness of a man who doesn't know where to stand in a story he didn't write. The screen blinked through 2 layers of clearance, and then a third, each gate slower than the last. Finally, a personnel entry opened, not with the tidy list an ordinary file gives, but with a skeletal outline wrapped in black bars. Unit Association pop-up, Special Tactics, Air Support, 24th STS Detachments, informal call sign, Shadow Vipers. Operational endorsements sealed, Valor Awards redacted. Qualification suite, flight line crisis management, aerial delivery in contested environments, systems override mastery. The rank field was marked with the same ellipses as the rest, but Mercer didn't need a line of text to tell him what he was already feeling as certainty in the bones. He closed the cover and looked at Ward with the same respect he would have used for a flag or a folded pair of hands. Then he drew himself to attention and lifted his right hand into a crisp salute. He didn't make a speech. He didn't explain his reasons. He simply held the salute until Ward answered it with a small nod, the kind that accepts honor without inviting more of it. The flight line, a noisy place on any day, learned how to be silent. When Mercer dropped his hand, he faced Hale the way an older brother faces a younger one after the lesson has already been learned. His voice stayed low, which made it travel farther. "Colonel," he said, "you addressed an airman for ink and size. You missed a technician's hands." He didn't list credentials. He didn't need to. Every pair of eyes on that ramp had just watched the only kind of resume that matters in a storm. Hale's posture sank by a half-inch the way pride sinks when it realizes it has been standing on something that wasn't ground. He tried to speak, found nothing, and kept his mouth shut. Mercer handed the tablet back to the staff sergeant and let the crowd choose who they wanted to listen to from that point forward. They chose quickly. They stepped toward Ward. It wasn't a crowd pressing for autographs. It was pilots and loaders and sergeants with questions they didn't know they had until they stopped pretending they had all the answers. "What did you feel?" first a young lieutenant asked. The change in pitch Ward said almost absent-mindedly, eyes still taking in the deck. "A chain sings true when the load shares weight. You heard it go flat. That told you where to talk to it." She didn't dramatize. She didn't shrink. She spoke like a good teacher in a quiet room. Hale returned an hour later, his cap in his hand, his swagger gone to ground. He found Ward showing a nervous new airman how to set a buckle so that it would still close after the second check. He waited for Ward to finish the sentence before he spoke. "Airman Ward," he said. The man teetered on the edge of his tongue, not sure whether it would be accepted or feel like theater. He chose not to pretend he knew which to use. "I owe you an apology," he continued in a voice shorn of parade gloss. "I addressed the uniform and missed the professional wearings it. I was wrong. I'm grateful for what you did here, for what you knew to do here." He gestured to the chalk line a senior chief had drawn on the ramp's lip to mark the place where 10 tons had decided not to take one more inch. "And I'm ashamed of how I started this day." Ward looked up, steady, unreadable kind. "Understood, sir," she said, and gave him the grace of making it simple. Then she turned back to the young airman and set the ratchet 2 clicks past snug. "Listen for the note," she said. "If both sides sing the same, the pallet will stop arguing." The lesson was a small one. Most of the good ones are. By evening, a name had attached itself to the chalk mark because names do that to things that save us. Ward's line didn't need paint. It needed only to be pointed at by people who wanted to explain why they now did their work with 2 degrees more care. Pilots who used to swagger past crew chiefs slowed, leaned on the rail and asked, "Anything you don't like?" Loadmasters who had never liked being called just loaders found themselves addressed as the first and best line of risk management on a deck that had learned what risk can look like when it goes hunting for a headline. In the break room, someone wrote 4 words on the whiteboard and put a box around them. "Look at their hands." The story hardened into practice faster than most myths do because it contained a set of instructions hiding inside it. The training shop rewrote the first block for new officers and airmen. Behavior over appearance wasn't a slogan. It was a checklist: posture, hands, breath, horizon, then switchology. "Horizon?" a captain asked. A master sergeant nodded toward the open ramp where the sky and the concrete met. "If they never look up, they'll never see the problem coming in time." Manual override drills moved from last on the agenda to first. They ran the sequence slowly, and then under stress, rain hose from a tower recorded alarm klaxons blaring until calm was no longer an accident of temperament, but a skill the body could find when it needed it. General Mercer signed a 1-page bulletin that hardly used any adjectives. It didn't need to. "Authority is granted by rank," it read. "Trust is earned by results. Read the work." He asked for nothing his rank could not ask and modeled everything the lesson demanded. He began opening briefs at the cargo door, not the cockpit, and asked a question he wished he had asked his younger self more often. "What is the load telling you?" Colonel Hale took the question and made it his own. It sounded different in his voice, penitent without being theatrical, interested without pretending to be expert, but people heard it anyway and answered with better work. Ward did not become a mascot. She declined an invitation to a base photo op. Not rudely, just the way people decline things that change the subject away from the thing that matters. She stood a pace back from the workbench and taught. She found calm in people before she trusted calm in machines. She had rookies breathe in through the nose, out through the feet, a trick that looked silly until the hands stopped shaking. She taught them to hear steel sing and to read a pallet's posture like a person's. "Loads want to tell you where they're weak," she said. "That's not a betrayal. That's a gift." The chalk mark didn't last a week because chalk doesn't. The memory did. Ward's line became a phrase that meant this is as close as we allow chaos to get. When something heavy started to misbehave, someone always said, "Watch the line," and everyone did. The phrase traveled beyond the flight line. In maintenance bays, a tech closing a panel reminded a pilot Ward's line, and the pilot nodded and ran a finger along the seal until the fingertip felt right. In the simulator, when an actuator failed on purpose, the new sequence felt less like a test and more like a rehearsal for something inevitable that would not be allowed to become a drama. On a wet Thursday 2 months later, the training director hauled a folding table out onto the ramp and set a single object in the center, a plain worn winch handle. He didn't run a ceremony. He didn't mount a plaque. He let the tool sit there for a week, so people would get tired of walking around it, then ask why it was there. When they did, the answer was always the same, because someone knew exactly when to use it. By then, it didn't need a label. Hale changed in ways visible to anyone who wanted to look. He still briefed, Hard still expected speed, still flinched when schedules slipped, but he no longer mistook volume for urgency or ease for competence. He didn't perform contrition, he practiced it. He began walking the line before he walked the wing, listening to the hands describe their work. He learned to ask the old NCOs what they were seeing when all he could see were numbers that didn't know how to tell him anything on their own. Mercer did the quiet part well because he always had. He asked a JAG to make sure the camera angles of the incident were boxed and logged as training material under the right classification, not a trophy for a briefing slideshow. He told the PA shop to leave it alone. He understood that some lessons work better as doctrine than as publicity. He also knew that legends get brittle under lights. He wanted this one to stay supple, a story you could use to teach a rookie how to see, instead of a story you could use to show a visitor where your heroes had stood. When the message spread off base, as messages always do, it did not travel as gossip so much as guidance. A Marine Air Wing asked for the new block on behavior first checks. An Army logistics school invited a master sergeant to explain reading a load. A Navy crew chief wrote back after watching the module, different deck, same physics. Respect. Nothing in the curriculum used the words shadow vipers or gave a biography. Nothing needed to. The doctrine did the talking. On a cold morning, Mercer stopped on the ramp where the chalk mark had been and found Ward at the edge of the bay showing a young captain how to listen for the matching note on a cross chain. He stood a few moments without interrupting the class, which is a habit that keeps good things happening. When she finished, he walked over and spoke so the wind wouldn't carry his words where they didn't need to go. "You did a day's work," he said. "That work changed how we do this work." Ward tilted her head a degree and let the compliment rest without being forced into a spotlight. "We owe each other good habits," she said. "They're lighter to carry than apologies." Hale's apology had already bought itself a second life in his own mouth. He folded it into the way he corrected people, fewer hard edges, more questions that begin with, "Show me." He wasn't soft, he was accurate. There's a difference, and people who work under pressure can feel it in their bones. He quoted Ward without getting her name wrong. 2 clicks past, snug, he would say, and a young airman would grin because it meant he was listening to the same song. Look at their hands became more than a whiteboard box. It became a reflex. New lieutenants learned to spot composure under stress the way experienced gunners learned to spot wind. They graded themselves on how quickly they invited subject matter experts into the conversation, not on how long they could talk without them. They learned what Mercer had tried to teach every officer who worked for him: authority makes a meeting go faster. Trust makes a mission land. One evening, with the winter sun going down orange behind the hangars, an old chief wheeled a battered hand truck up to the edge of the ramp. He set a small metal case down and snapped it open. Inside lay a coil of chalk line and a stick of white chalk worn almost to the nub. He put the chalk in Ward's palm. "Renew the mark," he said, as if he were asking her to bless something that needed no priest. Ward laid the line straight, and Truce snapped it once, and a clean white stripe appeared again where 10 tons had once thought the edge might welcome them. Nothing in the world can make a line permanent, but reminding ourselves where it belongs is part of how we keep our balance. A month after that, a visiting staffer from a Capitol Hill office took a tour of the flight line. He had a staffer's questions and a staffer's schedule and a staffer's appreciation for shiny things. He pointed to the crisp line of white chalk and asked what it meant, expecting a story about safety protocols. The senior master sergeant, who walked him around, didn't tell him about actuators or winch handles. He looked at the man's hands instead, soft, careful, unused to cold metal, and answered in a way he might understand anyway. "It's where we learn to look twice before we speak," once he said, and the staffer nodded as if he had thought of it first. What lasts in a place like that isn't a plaque or a photograph or the way a salute looks in rain. It's the grammar of small movements done right, the music of metal that is learned to sing on pitch, the training blocks that begin with posture and end with switchology instead of the other way around. It's the habit of siding with the person who shows with calm hands and steady breath how a bad minute becomes a survivable one. It's the knowledge that when pressure spikes and borrowed certainty fails, the quiet professional is the person you want in the frame because that's when the room needs less theater and more proof. If you ask the old hands on that ramp what they remember first, some will say the sound the chains made breaking others, the way the pallet sighed when it decided to stop, and a few will say the strangest thing was the silence that descended after General Mercer's salute, a silence that felt like the whole base resetting its jaw. If you ask the younger ones, they'll tell you about the chalk, the winch handle, and the day the brief moved to the cargo door. If you ask Ward, she'll shrug the question off gently and point you to the nearest set of hands that need to learn to hear steel sing. She knows her story will outlast her name only if it keeps being told in the small ways people do their jobs. For the men and women who have spent years on cold concrete under open sky, the morale lands without needing a narrator. Authority can seat you at the table. Competence will keep everyone at it when the table starts to shake. Respect is not paid to volume or swagger. It finds the person who does the next right thing exactly when it has to be done. On a stormy day when rank mistook a risk for an insult and size for a qualification, Talia Ward reminded a ramp and then a base and then a slice of a service what to look at when the wind picks up. Watch the hands, watch the breath, watch the mind. And when the load tries to talk you into believing it wants to go its own way, talk back to it in the language of physics, patience, and timing, and let the metal do what it most wants to do when someone steady is listening. Hold.